Hi comic book fans, and welcome to another suddenlycomics.com video. And today I thought I'd do a slightly different video. I thought I'd make a video for people who are thinking about getting started in comic collecting. So I was speaking to a guy the other day and I said I collected comics, and he said, oh, I thought about collecting comics, but I wouldn't really know where to get started. I also thought, if I went back 50 years, yes, 50 years, to when I started collecting comics, what advice would I give myself? So I have come up with 10 tips for people who are thinking of starting to collect comics, whatever age they are. But so hopefully these tips will work whether you're 12, like I was when I started collecting comics, or indeed if you're starting to collect comics and you're 30, 40, 50 or 60, or even 70. Right, so here we go. My first tip is set a realistic budget. Okay, there are a heck of a lot of comics out there. You're not going to own them all, and you're not going to own them all immediately. So make a realistic budget about how much you can afford to spend on comics each month, and put that aside and try and restrict what you spend to the amount of money that you've budgeted for that. Okay. So for instance, when I first started, I was using my pocket money, which was not a huge amount of money. And so I'd often have to save it up just to buy a single comic. But I would also do a bit of trading. So I would buy a comic and then sell it for a higher price and buy more comics. So that's another way of doing it, is that you can buy comics, sell them for a higher price and use them to buy more comics. Anyway, so set a budget is tip 1. Right. Tip 2 is decide what it is you want to collect, right? There are a load of comics out there, and every week there's even more of them. So it is important to decide what it is you want to collect. Now, there's a number of things you can decide. So a lot of people decide to collect a character. So some people decide they want to collect Spider-Man, or some people might decide they want to collect Batman, or you might decide you want to collect SpongeBob. Okay. Alternatively, you could actually say, well, actually what I want to do is collect a particular title. So I want to collect X-Men, or I want to collect Batman, the detective comics. Another thing you could do is you could say, I want to collect a particular artist. I really like a particular artist and I'm going to collect the work of that artist. And finally, another option would be to say, I'm going to collect the work of a particular writer of comics because I like that writer. Now, myself, when I started collecting, I collected two things. I focused on collecting Batman, and I focused on collecting a series called Brave and the Bold, which was a bit of a double whammy because a lot of the Brave and the Bolds had Batman in them. And I became a bit of an expert on Brave and the Bold, and I knew what the issues were, I knew what the values of them were, and because I became an expert in it, it meant that I could go to a comic mart and I could look at them and I'd know whether those comics were a good bargain or not, and I'd also know whether I needed a particular issue or not. So that's tip 2, is decide what you want to collect. Okay, right, now the third thing is you're going to need somewhere to get your comics from. There are comics in your local shop usually. My local co-op doesn't sell comics, nor does my local Tesco's. So if you want to collect comics, I suggest one of the things you should do is find out where your nearest local comic shops are. Most large towns and cities will have a comic shop. So go on to Google and type in comic shops and your town, and it'll come up with the nearest comic shops. What I then suggest you do is you actually get them, maybe 3 or 4 within a similar distance to you. So what I would do is actually go and visit all 3 or 4 of them and decide which one you like the most, which one is the friendliest, which one has the type of comics that you want to collect, and then that can become your local comic store. So that would be my third tip: find your local comic store. Okay. The next thing I'd say is that if you're collecting something, you really want to be in a community, because you want to talk to people who've got a similar hobby to you've got. Now, you could meet people at your local comic store. For instance, my one in Battlesbridge in Essex, Nerd Base, there's a group that meets there on a Saturday, and they all get together and talk about comics. So that's a good community to join if there's a community at a local comic shop. Alternatively, you can join social media groups. There's lots of Facebook groups for comic collectors, Instagram groups, and go and watch YouTube videos about comics, because there's a community there as well of people who make and watch YouTube content about comics. Me, I'm one of them. Right, so that would be my next suggestion, is become part of a comic community. Right, next tip is, I think it's quite useful, is make a list of your want comics, the comics that you want, and get to know those comics and get to know their value. Now, why should you do that? You're not going to be able to afford them, you've got a budget, but if you know them, you can take the opportunity. So specifically, if you're shuffling through some comics in a comic store, if you know what your key comics are and you know what you're prepared to pay for them, then that's the way you can get a bargain, because you know what you're looking for, what price is a reasonable price. And that's how I've had most of my major bargains, is because I have known the value of that particular comic, and the person who's selling it either doesn't know the value, or they're selling it very cheap to sell it. So keep a list of your key want comics. Okay, so that was tip number 5. Right, my next tip is use multiple places to buy comics, because that way you're going to find the best deal. So yes, use your local comic store, but have a look at eBay. I have grabbed quite a few bargains on eBay. There are eBay bargains to be had out there, especially for comics that nobody else is looking for, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Facebook groups, the Facebook groups, there's a lot of Facebook groups in the UK which sell comics, and they are there specifically to sell comics. And I find that if you can find a comic on a Facebook group, you're generally going to pay less for it than you are at a comic shop or on eBay. Instagram, you can buy comics on Instagram. I've used Facebook Marketplace to buy comics. Also, have a look, and once you're into the hobby, I would suggest that you go to one of the many comic conventions in the UK. There's some big ones in London. Most of the big cities will have comic conventions or comic marts. Just type comic conventions, comic marts, the city that you're nearest, and you'll see comic events, and you can go to those and you can buy comics there. So that is my next tip, is use multiple places to buy comics. Right, now my next tip is tip number 7, and that is avoid FOMO. Avoid fear of missing out. Right. So when you're in these social media groups, you watch YouTube, you will see a lot of hype about particular comics, usually associated with the latest movie, the latest TV series, the latest comic that's come out. I mean, so I, for instance, never ever buy a comic that's come out and the price has rocketed. I'll buy it at cover price, but I will not pay $50 or $60 for a new comic that's just come out and is got hyped. So don't fall for FOMO. In fact, I would say go the opposite way. One of the things to do is actually buy the things nobody else is looking at, because you'll get a much, much better price. You know, this is where you get bargains on eBay, is if you go and search for something, nobody else is looking for it. If it's on an auction, it's got a low start price, you can be the only bidder and you'll get a good deal. You will not get a good deal on something that is hyped up and has spiked. Okay, that links to my next tip number 8, which is have a pull list. Right, so if you're with a local comic store, or actually there's a number of eBay stores that will do this as well, you can pre-order comics. So you can see the comics, you can go and see previews, and you can see a list of comics that are coming out a couple of months ahead. And most local comic shops and a number of the online stores will allow you to pre-order comics at the pre-order price. Now, this is a way of avoiding the high prices for new comics, because if you pre-order it, your store should sell it to you for the price that it's for its cover price. Not only that, actually, but quite a few local comic stores and the online stores will actually give you a discount on pre-orders or orders of multiple comics. So I use a couple online. I use a company called Comic Biz. I use another one called A Place in Space. And there's another one called Sad Lemon. Most of those will give you a 20% discount on pre-orders or orders of comics where you order 5 or more. So make use of that. 20%, quite a lot on new comics. So have a pull list. Also, by having a pull list, you're not going to miss out on a key issue for the comic you are collecting. So there we go. That's my 8th tip. Have a pull list. Right. Next up, so you've now got all these comics. Now it's important, if you're a collector like me, I've had comics, some of my comics I've had for 50 years. You need to make sure that their condition is preserved. So you need to invest in some bags to store the comics in, some boards to back them with, and you need to make sure you get the right type of bag and boards, so that the boards need to be acid free, independently tested acid free backing boards, and you need to be using bags from a reputable company, again acid free, to protect your comics. I generally use My Lights and Ultimate Guard backing boards. Right, so that will protect your comics, but where are you going to put them? Because if you scatter them all over the floor, people who you live with are not going to be very happy. Even if you live alone and you scatter them all over the floor, you're going to tread on them and damage them. So I don't suggest that. I suggest you invest in some comic boxes, and that you store your comics nicely bagged and boarded in your comic boxes, and I suggest you catalogue them so you know which comics are in which box, so that when you want to find a comic, you can find it easily and it doesn't take you about 2 hours to find the comic that you want. Right, so my last tip, and this is the most important tip of all: have fun. This is a hobby, and the point of it is that you enjoy it. If you're not enjoying it, stop it, sell all your comics and go and do something else. So I enjoy collecting comics. It's my one of my key hobbies. Um, and it's important that you enjoy it. If it stops being enjoyable, stop it. But I've been doing it for 50 years and I've always found it enjoyable. Keep it fresh, talk to people and have fun. So my final tip to starting comic collection is have fun. There we go. Enough said. If you've got any questions, you're thinking about getting started in comics, if you want to have a chat with me, let me know. I'm happy to talk to you if you want to talk more about how to get started in comics. Enough said.